Buenas tardes a todas. Bienvenidas a la última sesión de este curso Utópicos 90. Ha pasado entre pandemias, confinamientos, ha sido de todo menos utópico este tiempo, pero parece que hoy, al ser este último día, podíamos recordar un poco esa primera sesión, aún antes de todo, en la que planteábamos un poco a modo de marco este contexto de los años 90, en el que tras la caída del muro de Berlín y pese a las previsiones de figuras tan neoliberales como Margaret Thatcher de que aquello iba a ser el final de la sociabilidad, la década, sin embargo, demostró todo lo contrario y, como hemos ido viendo, fue una década rica en creatividad activista que se desarrolló a partir de una multitud de movimientos enormemente locales, pero que también buscaron una coordinación global. También fue un momento enormemente rico en ideaciones políticas en el mundo del arte, que no fue ajeno a estos procesos que estaban teniendo lugar en el ámbito del activismo y se contaminó de muchas de las formas, de muchos de los lenguajes, de muchos de los modos de hacer, a veces o a menudo, con unas paradojas enormes que tenían que ver con el propio lugar de enunciación, que por supuesto en el mundo del arte era diferente al que estaba sucediendo en el activismo. Aunque no siempre era un lugar diferente, ya hemos visto, por ejemplo, las iniciativas de espacios autogestionados y los espacios de un tamaño más humilde, más molecular, que también proliferaron en el mundo del arte en este periodo. El curso ha ido oscilando de nuevo, como la propia década, entre este punto de vista más local y este punto de vista más global, entre las iniciativas de distinta escala. Jesús Carrillo nos llevó al madrileño barrio de Lavapiés con los proyectos situados en esa fértil zona gris entre el arte y el activismo, entre la performance y la acción directa, recuperando figuras y acciones que hoy en día han sido en muchas ocasiones olvidadas, pese a que muchas personas continúan siendo la memoria viva de estos movimientos. Y recientemente el propio Carrillo ha historizado muchos de estos procesos en su último libro. Ana María Aguas, por su parte, nos condujo por los vericuetos de este proceso paralelo a la globalización económica, que fue la globalización del mundo del arte, a partir de la proliferación de bienales, documentas, ferias de arte que se produjo fundamentalmente en los años 90, aunque tenía sus raíces en momentos anteriores. Y luego, después de Ana María Aguas, y ya en un contexto distópico de conferencias llevadas a cabo al otro lado de un ordenador y de un mundo interconectado ya por Internet, en el que las relaciones de comunidad directa parecen estar mucho más en peligro de lo que estaban en los 90. En ese contexto ya nos habló Lara Almarcegui, recorriendo una trayectoria en el que pudimos revisitar este interés por el situacionismo que tuvo lugar también en esta década y que se relacionaba con la problemática, con la preocupación por la problemática social y por la sociabilidad también, la preocupación por el asunto de la sociabilidad. Y siguiendo a Lara, Nacheli Jiménez del Val nos habló por su parte de uno de los movimientos que más importantes serían en estos momentos para el activismo, que sería el caso del Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, que no solo a partir de su trayectoria real, sino también a través de cómo fue evocado por toda una serie de activistas occidentales que veían en ellos el último movimiento revolucionario y que se inspiraron en ellos, y también gracias a los encuentros que organizaron en México empezaron a coordinarse. Fefa Vila, en la última sesión, nos habló de nuevo de un contexto más local, de las luchas y las iniciativas queer y feministas en el Estado español y fundamentalmente en Madrid, y en ocasiones algunas en las que ella misma participó, ya que es un contexto, un entramado del cual ella misma formó parte. Y hoy tenemos en nuestra última sesión de nuevo, en este zoom in y zoom out que hemos estado haciendo continuamente, una visión de carácter más global que conecta con la primera sesión de este curso, que se planteaba un poco como una sesión marco y que lleva a cabo una reflexión final acerca de este mundo del arte que está intentando recoger todos estos esfuerzos, todas estas reflexiones en torno a la comunidad, en torno a la sociabilidad, en torno a las dimensiones globales de lo local. Y Lars Bang Larsen nos va a hablar también desde una perspectiva de alguien que formó parte de estos procesos, al igual que lo han hecho otros conferenciantes, otras conferenciantes de este curso, y nos va a ofrecer la visión de alguien que participó tanto como agente como observador, ¿no? En esta posición intermedia de alguien que es a la vez un curador de arte y también un escritor acerca de arte. Lars Bang Larsen es historiador del arte y trabaja como comisario en el Moderna Museet de Estocolmo y ha sido co-curador de exposiciones como Incertidumbre Viva, la 32ª Bienal de Arte de Sao Paulo en 2016, o la exposición que se celebró en el Museo Reina Sofía de Madrid sobre Dierk Schmidt en 2018, además de otras muestras más recientes como la diatriba sobre la tecnología en el Moderna Museet el año pasado, en 2019. Asimismo, también es autor de libros como The Model, A Model for a Qualitative Society, publicado precisamente por el Macba hace justo 10 años, o Arte y Norma, publicado por Cruce en 2016, o Networks, que es uno de estos libros de la serie publicada por la Whitechapel Gallery de readers acerca de distintos temas de arte contemporáneo. Se ha interesado durante toda su trayectoria por asuntos como la contracultura, las huellas de la contracultura, las huellas de los 60 y como aquellas búsquedas que se llevaron a cabo en esa década de experimentación social, experimentación colectiva, fueron retomadas en parte durante los años 90 y primeros 2000. Y no quiero quitarle más tiempo, sí me gustaría dejar abierta la idea de que esta última sesión sería lo ideal que pudiésemos también hacer una especie de recapitulación colectiva a partir de la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, que como siempre serán escritas en el chat y yo las leeré en voz alta para que las pueda responder el conferenciante, en este caso Lars. Y en la conferencia de hoy será la única de este curso que tendrá lugar en inglés, por lo cual os apremio a que miréis la plataforma del Zoom. Abajo a la derecha, justo al lado del botón de preguntas y respuestas, hay un botón que pone interpretación y que tiene una especie de un icono que tiene una especie de bola del mundo, y cuando clicáis ahí podréis encontrar una opción de español y se llevará a cabo, si clicáis en la opción de español tendréis una traducción simultánea de lo que está diciendo Lars. Y bueno, muchas gracias a todo el equipo y muchas gracias Lars por estar aquí con nosotras virtualmente.
Thank you, Julia. Do you hear me okay? Am I going through? All right. I get a... yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you, Julia, for the invitation to speak in the series of Utopian 90s. I also would like to thank Alicia Escobio for organizing everything, and to Ricardo and Silvia for technical setup and for the translation. I'm just going to share my screen now and show my PowerPoint. There we are. So since I received the invitation from Julia to speak in this lecture series on, or the course on Utopian 90s, I thought a lot about how to approach the topic and how to talk about it. And given that my talk was postponed for pandemic reasons, I've had an even longer time to prepare than was originally planned. But even so, I'm hesitant about the task at hand. I do have certain ideas about how to convey aspects and impressions of the art of the 90s, and about how to propose to make legible this period in contemporary art. But I'm not entirely sure what 90s I want to construct. For one thing, this is because the art of the 90s was a composite phenomenon, a multifaceted phenomenon that cannot be subsumed by or told through a single narrative. And I believe art historians are still very much in the process of dealing with the reception of the decade now in what is maybe a second wave of reception. And secondly, I'm not strictly speaking a researcher of the art of the 90s. Instead, I was a witness to activities at the time. I was a participant. I was an agent of the art of this decade. So I'm not only a historical subject, I'm also kind of an object in this discussion and a product of this history. So I'm implicated. And when I talk about the 90s, I'm also trying to self-evaluate, which doesn't make it any easier. As a brief self-introduction, I can say that I was among the writers and curators of the 90s who at the time promoted the term social in art. So in the mid-90s, I started working as a critic for journals in the Nordic region and abroad, and I got involved in curating too. Before the advent of internet platforms for art, the magazine format was an important medium and I guess characteristic of the international mediation of contemporary art at the time. In a text that I published in After All journal in '99, I talked about social aesthetics, or what I choose to call social aesthetics, which was a concept that I used to build a genealogy of Nordic art and counterculture from the late 60s to the turn of the millennium. And I defined social aesthetics as an artistic attitude focusing on the world of acts that experiments with the transgressions of various economies. I still think it was important to try to connect artistic production to countercultures and to activism, but today I'm a little disenchanted with the term social aesthetics that I think has a retro modernist ring to it, and it was also a very 90s attempt in its implicit discussion with Nicolas Bourriaud's relational aesthetics. Both the terms social and utopia come with big claims of ethics and agency in relation to art's possibility for shaping society. And I believe that for this reason, they are terms and ideas that deserve to be read very closely, maybe until they fall into bits and pieces that we can put together again. And when a cultural phenomenon or an artistic phenomenon is dubbed a turn, as it was the case with the social turn, an affirmation takes place that we will need to get around to approach this phenomenon anew. I have structured my talk simply according to the three basic terms of the Utopian 90s course. That is the 90s, the social, and the utopian. By revisiting more or less known artistic practices, primarily but not exclusively from my Scandinavian context, I hope to introduce to some problematics by reading for contradictions and tensions, and for historic breaks and continuities. I also hope to suggest or outline political economies around art and social and historical events involved in informing the social and utopian in the art of the 90s. If I have an overall claim or hypothesis for this talk, it would be that what we call the 90s was a passage for contemporary art as we have come to know it. A certain institutional formatting took place of ideas, of practices, and critical terms. That is, a formatting of the conditions of possibility of contemporary art as a paradigm that seems to be changing around us now. On that note, I'll begin with the 90s, and unsurprisingly, with an image of the fall of the Berlin Wall in November '89. So the 90s was the moment just before the pervasive digitalization of life, at least in our European part of the world. It was when art was more modestly scaled and not so integrated with the surrounding social fabric. It was before the biggest commercial galleries had branches in metropolises around the world, and before you talked about the art system in terms of an industry. You would talk about the culture industry or the consciousness industry, maybe, but not the art industry, as it is sometimes done today. It was also before we had a name for the Anthropocene, and before gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and decolonization were zones of artistic and cultural contestation to the extent that they are today. And it was before a comprehensive destabilization of the modern order took hold in Western culture. In artistic production at the time, new post-media attitudes went beyond the art object and the traditionalism of the 1980s with its love for painting and sculpture. There was a new mobility and internationalism, and there were new easygoing ways to relate to art. And unbelievably, from our perspective today, the term contemporary art had a controversial edge, at least in my neck of the woods in Copenhagen. Back then, contemporary art announced a break with an old order, which was, of course, exhilarating and exciting. The logic of connecting certain types of artistic expression to certain decades is strong in the field of art, probably because this is suggestive of change of paradigms, of intergenerational handovers of power, of a certain progression of ideas, and so on. But obviously, calendar time is an unclear marker because it's indifferent to the historic event. This is also the case in our case in relation to our discussion. So in 1989, the Iron Curtain fell, marking the end of the Cold War. But we tend to forget that there was a major stock market crash already in 1987 that knocked out the booming art market of the 80s that had thrived on the forms of painting that art historian Benjamin Buchloh criticized as ciphers of regression in an essay with the same title from 1981. And in spite of the major ruptures in political and social orders, both Eastern and Western Europe in the 90s were characterized by continuing processes of privatization initiated in the 80s. Just to say that it's not entirely clear when the 1990s began. It took a few years for the 90s to gain the features that we've come to recognize as its own. It's important to say that a shift took place during the 90s. So what began in the late 80s as a sort of paralysis of the art world ended up around the turn of the millennium as a new and flourishing order of production. By the end of the 90s, a new complex of mediation had developed around contemporary art that was by now a phenomenon that yielded power and self-confidence. As Julia also mentioned in her introduction, one could point to the growth of biennials worldwide, to new players in the gallery scene, and the quantitative growth of art institutions. So if we start out by considering the paralysis or the prelude to the 90s, maybe there is even a small decade hidden between the 80s and the 90s that we could call the 1980s and a half, or the not yet 90s. On the Copenhagen art scene, this would be represented by Concern, an artist group that existed between 89 and 93, with an all-male cast of Jakob Jakobsen, Søren Andreasen, Jørgen Mikkelsen, and Jan Bæklund. The four of them found each other as young, failed painters, and as a group or a collaborative, they held events and exhibitions in galleries and in public space, typically addressing a local or national context. Here with a project that idiosyncratically annotates symbolist painter Willumsen, who very few people outside of Denmark will know. Concern also published a magazine that was exclusively dedicated to their own texts. Their writings were cryptical, playful, and oozing irony. Produced with the surrealist exquisite corpse method, the members of Concern took turns to mercilessly edit and rewrite each other's texts. Text robbing, they called it. It was a method with its own violence and potential for conflict among the members of the group, at the same time as it was a way for them to teach each other and to learn in a kind of collective schooling. You could say that Concern exacerbated conceptualist strategies into a position that was neither sober nor oriented towards transparency, but instead polemicized the art concept and its cultural underpinnings. Strategies of deconstruction and appropriation were big at this point, and Concern's approach was typical of this by exploding hierarchies of knowledge between the theory of art and the making of art. They mixed everything together. A historiographic reason that I mention Concern here is that they are considered a bit of an anomaly, or at least they don't have any reception to speak of, neither in Danish curating nor in Danish art history. So in art historical terms, they are unfortunately total losers, to be impolite but frank about the state of their reception. And this is probably because they don't fit the art historical standard narratives of the traditionalist art of the 80s versus the social turn of the 1990s. The Concern group and its members were inspired by international trends in post-conceptual art, including the slightly earlier Moscow artist group Inspection Medical Hermeneutics. The Concern members acknowledged that they probably couldn't have existed without the example of Inspection Medical Hermeneutics. So Concern can be seen as a kind of Danish copy group of the Russian collective. Inspection Medical Hermeneutics described their method not as an evolution, but a form of illness, something that should be cured. During the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Inspection Medical Hermeneutics produced what they called a thick mumble, white noise, and other incomprehensible, unclear things, to quote Pavel Pepperstein, a member of the group. Their practice was based on conversations recorded on tape between the members, speech acts that effectuated what they called inspections and diagnoses of the organization or the messing up of knowledge. The title of the installation, Amber Room, from 1991, refers to the legend of Tsarina Catherine II's hiding place from her enemies, a room made entirely out of amber. The smiling faces on the balloons and on the apples depict Kolobok, and Kolobok is a shape-shifting character from a folktale, a Russian folktale. Kolobok is always running away, and to be like Kolobok stands for a specific attitude of artists who have a penchant for slipping away when aggressive interpretation sets in. The framed photos of icons together with cushions resemble domestic Orthodox shrines. The icons have been recorded sideways instead of frontally, thus demonstrating perspective, a Western invention that is usually denied in Orthodox representations. The 90s, or the historical orientation of 90s art towards the art of the 60s has often been mentioned, but it's important that positions in the 80s also played a role for the 90s. And I guess it was unusual for Concern as a Scandinavian artist group to be inspired by a late Soviet artist group. But if you look to the States, the pictures generation in the US would be an important example of an influential position in between, or in the 80s, as well as the New York art collective Group Material and their brand of aesthetically reflected exhibition making and art activism. Both the pictures generation and Group Material dealt in different ways with art's open-ended relationship to visual culture in general. Perhaps the 90s started as late as with Nicolas Bourriaud's exhibition Traffic at the CAPC in Bordeaux in 96. Traffic was a characteristically upbeat exhibition, and the curatorial statement that accompanied Bourriaud's influential and later much criticized text on relational aesthetics that came with proposals of artistic conviviality and micro-utopias, and proposals of art's location in social in-between spaces. It's a very famous text, so I'm sure you are familiar with its arguments. At Traffic, visitors encountered a group of young and predominantly Western European artists such as Pierre Weig, Vanessa Beecroft, Mauricia Catalan, Liam Gillick, Gillian Waring. And Traffic was an influential manifestation as a generational statement of young art at the time. In the bigger picture, maybe the 90s, or what we call the 90s, played out across the turn of the millennium. We could take our bearings from Tony Blair's reign as a British Prime Minister from 97 to 2007, which more or less coincided with Gerhard Schröder's time as a German Chancellor. Both of them ended long periods of conservative rule in their countries with their so-called third way politics, an influential and neoliberalized version of social democratism. And I can add that this is also important to my narrative, because third way ideology and politics informed Scandinavian governments at the time too. I think in Spain at the time, the 90s and the early 2000s were classically divided by PSOE and PP, between González and Aznar. In any case, art, especially visual art, was a part of the ideological package of third way politics. So in Blair's Britain, the private entrepreneur was compared to the artist and the artist to the entrepreneur, thereby indicating how the sign of art could explicitly be employed for purposes of the innovation of markets and the regeneration of the social sphere. So in this light, art became a kind of gold dust of social reproduction, and the artist became a socially exemplary figure. This had effects for how artistic production could be organized and perceived. The figure of the author was potentially affirmed as a functional and high-powered mediator, a networked actor, an operator of flows of information, and a manager of the studio as a unit of production. I also mention this because some of the most internationally visible names from the Scandinavian 90s organized their authorships in studios that were or are a kind of small factories or corporate entities or corporate units that employ assistants, technical experts, and subcontractors. This is, of course, very common for artists that have a big demand for their work. Or this type of organization was made increasingly common by the contemporary art of the 90s. I'm not raising this question to discuss the projects of Eliasson, Elmgren and Draxet and Superflex, but I only very generally want to point to the fact that the scalability afforded by a managerial model of authorship and a large-scale studio practice must be taken into account because of the relations of production of the work of art, the divisions of labor that constitute it, and the social networks in which the work is inscribed. All of this is integral to the work. these are factors in the work's materiality and enunciation that relate to the social context of its time. And the common denominator of the productions of Eliasson, Elmgren and Draxen and Superflex, I think, would be their ability to keep up an artistic output on a large scale at a time when the role of the artist became socially exemplary. Maybe the 90s ended as late as maybe the 90s ended as late as 2009 with the financial crisis of this year that, if it hadn't been done before, spelled the end of Tony Blair's project of turning the so-called creative industries into engines of the national economy. But the discourse of creative industrialization can be seen to continue in today's experience economies. A colleague of mine recently said about the 90s that this was the time when contemporary art was not yet an industry. Bearing in mind the example of concern and inspection medical hermeneutics, I think there's some truth to this. On the other hand, though, signs of an industrialization of the art system had been evident for decades. The Swiss curator Harald Seemann became a paragon, a perfect example of curating in the 1990s, thanks to his work as an artistic director of the Documenta 5 in 1972, and of numerous biennials since then, including a Venice biennial in 1999, I believe it was. Seemann was a prototypical curator of contemporary art as an exhibition maker who was uncoupled from custodian responsibility. And he was also a new type of economic agent in the sense that he promoted private sponsorships for his early exhibitions in the 60s. You will also be familiar with his famous exhibition When Attitudes Become Form from, was it 68 or 69? Seemann was, according to art historian Caroline Jones, he was someone who would, in his career, deploy, I'm quoting now, he would deploy tropes of obsession, marginalization, and individualism to mask artists' imbrication into academies, markets, industries, politics, and nations, unquote. I think that if you're looking for a primal scene of contemporary art in the 90s sense of that term, Seemann's Documenta 5 is, for a number of reasons, a good place to start. For one thing, because of the curatorial attitude behind it that came with an infectious sense of entitlement. Seemann turned artistic freedom into curatorial freedom, you could say. And as Caroline Jones has it, he was someone who was capable of mediating and spinning aesthetic tropes of excess into something exciting for mainstream audiences while muting political economies around art. So as a decade, the 90s was a fluid entity with contradictory or asynchronic features whose art was part of larger social and historical reconfigurations. This brings me to the social. In the art around the turn of the millennium, the social suggested an opening up of art, a willingness to get out there and connect to other fields and disciplines. Art's autonomy was confronted, and the same was the private as a horizon for art consumption. The social, or the idea of the social, more or less explicitly promised to undo or bypass hierarchies such as high and low, art and non-art, artist and audience, form and content. And under the sign of the social, art turned away from eternity and towards everyday life. The cold-hearted postmodern theorizing of the 80s was subverted as 90s art blew away hermeneutic pleasure. In this way, by the mid-90s, Roland Barthes' idea of the pleasure of the text, le plaisir du texte, was gone, along with François Lyotard's reading of the Kantian sublime and Jean Baudrillard's theory of the simulacrum, all of which had been highly influential in the 80s and early 90s. And in the 90s, irony ceased to be a productive category. Ideas of the real and of reality were recovered mainly through concepts of interaction and participation, communication, use value, production, direct action, social space, basically the opposites of the textual parameters that were privileged by post-structuralist and postmodernist theory. So to put it briefly, it's on this background that the category of the social was named as a concern for art at the time. This was not without its political ironies. As art historian Hal Foster noted in his seminal book Return of the Real from '96, the neoliberal 90s continued the 80s trashing of the social contract and the cooperative state. In his work Middelburg, Summer 1996, the Danish artist Jens Honing infused the ready-made with alienation and social tension. In the public art space, the Vleeshal of the Dutch seaside resort Middelburg, Honing installed a Turkish-owned clothing factory called Maras Confectier from the neighboring town of Vlissingen, which agreed to move its workers and machines to the Vleeshal and continue their production here. During the art center's opening hours, Maras Confectier and its 12 workers from Iran, Turkey, and Bosnia were part of the installation. And as a visitor to the exhibition, quote unquote, you felt deterritorialized by the foreign workers, the textile factory set up, the Turkish football banners, and the Turkish blues music that played. Jens Honing's Fordist dramaturgy revolved around social fault lines, such as the legitimate uses of institutional space, the prestige and visibility of the art system versus the invisibility of the immigrant, the industrial labor of the textile workers versus the immaterial labor of the artist, and so on and so forth. A meditation on power, territory, and the production of space, Middelburg Summer '96 was a real-time social system dominated by the cultural and religious other. I think Honing's work is interesting to consider for our discussion here, also because it's a quite many-faceted beast. Middelburg Summer 1996 lends itself clearly to a discussion of the production of social space, at the same time as it's indebted to champion tradition of the ready-made and its semiotic of the cultural object that Honing extends towards the social event. Honing's work also has a pronounced psychosocial dimension, you could say, in its negotiation of intolerance and ethnic otherness that makes the work incompatible with user-friendly notions of participation and interactivity. Sorry. As I mentioned before, one of the ironies that came with the 90s tendency to work with social presence was that it was a decade haunted by a profound uncertainty of its historicity and its political ideologies. This would be Derrida's insight from his book Spectres of Marx from '93. In this book, Derrida makes the ghosts an ethical trope with the potential to rewrite history from unauthorized or silenced perspectives, specifically that of Marx as a namer of capitalism and as a thinker of the world market who haunted the victory that capitalism had claimed for itself after the demise of realized socialism in the East. In art history, critical terms of post-war neo-avant-gardes were still being negotiated, and relevant parts of recent art history were in the process of being recovered and remembered. And so you cannot convincingly argue that the 90s represent a new beginning for art, the way it has sometimes been done. Also in the field of art history, there was and in the field of contemporary art, there was a haunting taking place. I think there was too much conscious as well as unconscious rediscovery of 60s and 70s art history to call 90s art a new beginning. I remember the 90s as a decade that constantly sought for art historical qualification, and certain art historical analogies for contemporary art flourished with fluxus and situationism, for instance. Conceptualism of the 60s, Joseph Beuys's social sculpture was a term that was often mentioned. The work of Hannah Wilke as a feminist precursor, Jack Smith as a queer precursor to the 90s, the work of Gordon Matta Clark, etc., etc., etc. To give art history a global orientation at this point meant, for example, to include now unavoidable figures such as Leisha Clark and Elio Aichichika, whose work was brought to prominence at Catherine David's Documenta 10 in 97. Until then, the work of Clark and Aichichika had been considered a type of Latin American folklore in Western Europe. Also, in 2000, the Nordic region's no doubt most important figure of post-war art, Øyvind Fahlström, was given his first retrospective here at the Macba. And another Macba connection that I'll mention briefly is my book on Palle Nielsen's The Model for a Qualitative Society that Julia also mentioned in her introduction. This is a book that was published by Macba in 2010. And the model was, the project it refers to was an art activist mass utopia in the form of a children's adventure playground that Palle Nielsen realized in collaboration with Gunilla Lundahl and other activists at Stockholm's Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1968. And my book was a piece of research that was originally motivated by my intention of building genealogies for 90s art on historical work that hadn't been theorized or acknowledged by Scandinavian art history. But characteristically, perhaps, my book didn't see the light of day before 2010. And with this, on to Utopia. I've been speaking about various continuities between the 80s and the 90s, between the 60s and the 90s. But of course, there were historical breaks too. And I think that when we're looking back at the 90s, social art today is one such break, because today it becomes clear that social doesn't cut it anymore. Social is no longer enough. With this, I mean that one fundamental shift in relation to the 90s is that we're now aware that things are entangled in bigger and more than human communities and ecologies, and thus potentially in bigger alliances outside of an anthropocentric perspective too. This is a work by Rikke Luther, Danish artist, for the 2016 Sao Paulo Biennial. The work is called Overspill, Universal Map. And it's a large mural that depicts the so-called global commons that are protected more or less successfully by the United Nations. The four global commons are the high sea, the Antarctic, the atmosphere, and outer space. A live slime mold in a terrarium and the artist's impression of a million-year-old species of giant mushroom cast in concrete are also part of the installation. So in works such as this, the 90s social seems far away. The connection to the 90s is that Rikke Luther was part of the Copenhagen Collective in '55 that I will mention in a minute. I guess it's easy to be tough and critical on the idea of the social in art from today's point of view. the social in art will always be something mediated by artistic or institutional intent. And there are value transfers at work in the idea of socially engaged art. If the social is understood as qualitative content in an artwork, participation, togetherness, social amelioration, it can be politely turned away from political discussions and power critiques towards a social consensus or even an essential idea of the social. So the idea of a social art risks being imprecise, it risks being conceptually naive, it risks being limiting. It's interesting that the terms of the social and the utopian aren't necessarily compatible. For one thing, there is a tension between them that we can call chronopolitical, seeing that the social concerns society as it exists, and utopia concerns a social body that doesn't exist yet. Utopia was a term that was in the air in the 90s, and it was both propagated by institutions and used in relation to artistic practice. Utopia Station at the 2003 Venice Biennial was probably the most institutionally prominent example of such a utopian exhibition project. And it came with a, for the time, characteristic flexibility of programming, openness of structure, and a mix of discourse and artistic practice. I should say that I didn't see Utopia Station myself, so it's very limited what I can say about it. But I remember that the philosopher Boris Groys polemically and dryly noted that at Utopia Station, the utopia in question was the lifestyle of its participants, traveling around the art world like living installations. On the side of artistic practice, critics qualified the Copenhagen collective N55's project as utopian, though I don't remember that they used the term utopia themselves to talk about their own work. At the time when I wrote about them and worked with them in the 90s, there were 4 artists involved in N55, apart from Rikke Luther. It was Jon Sørvin, Cecilia Wendt, and Ingvild Aarbakke. And the project was carried by a strong sense of self-organization through which they reconstructed everyday objects such as the chair, the bed, the house, and so on. And so they constructed the N55 chair, the N55 bed, and finally the N55 space frame, which was not a conventional house, but instead a living unit built in a kind of intelligent Lego system made out of steel that was developed by N55. In order to bypass the art market, the procedures and recipes for building the group's functional art objects were shared in manuals that were distributed for free. So the utopian aspect of their practice, if you want to call it that, was not only the group's reinvention of everyday functions, but also in the way that their practice echoed the American engineer and countercultural hero Buckminster Fuller's work from the 60s. So I think there's a very distinct sort of 60s echo in N55's practice as well. So if utopia became a term in visual art around the turn of the millennium, it was utopia without revolution, without barbarity, nor was utopia necessarily about a glorious tomorrow. I'm saying this because there is a contrast here, a strong contrast to the 20th century. And Alain Badiou, the philosopher, proposes that the 20th century was driven by what he calls a passion for the real, with the real as the source of both horror and enthusiasm, simultaneously lethal and creative. Badiou's example is the violence that it took to create a new world or a new human being, a new human subject to master history, and the real as what had to be done to reach this utopia. whenever this new human subject or new social body was within reach, it turned the people of the old order into so much disposable material. This was the barbarity of 20th century utopias, according to Badiou. You can speculate when the 20th century stopped proposing the creation of a new world and a new man, as Badiou phrases it. Was it the hippies in the 60s with their faith and a biopower of pleasure? Or did it end with the Soviet project and its official agenda of communist man and woman? Or is such a project of a new world and a new human being still with us, although now in more subtle and controlled ways? That is, have we, since the 1980s, lived through the comprehensive social engineering of a neoliberal utopia that has given us the digitally self-managing individual in a financialized world? In any case, it was difficult to know what in the 90s assumed the role of the real or of political reality principles. For one thing, as something exceptional in the 20th century, the 90s didn't unfold under a global paradigm of war, not World War, not Cold War. Maybe it was this particular kind of unworried uncertainty itself that was celebrated as utopian. To venture a speculation or to venture a generalization about the 90s generation of artists, such as that represented at Bourriau's traffic exhibition, for instance, I would propose that it's a generation that based its practice on the art institution as its condition of possibility. What I mean is this: if experimental artists in the 60s and 70s tended to be politically idealist, at least rhetorically, and wanted the art institution to transform according to their political evaluations, and if the 80s generation was commercially cynical, and in this sense also wanted the art institution to be something else than what it was, and turn it into an extension of the commercial gallery, to put it plainly, then the 90s generation was, or is, for better or worse, one without any institutional naivety. In the 90s, the art institution, as it already existed, and what it could become as itself, was the condition of possibility for artistic practices. The institution was what realized art. The institution made art real. It was a realm of the possible, practically conditioned by urban contexts, architecture, budgets, logistics, communication networks, and so on. In other words, there was an awareness among the artists of the time that the institution socializes art, just as institutions socialize citizens. If it is like this, as I speculate here, this is potentially the road into a kind of social entropy or status quo for art. But it all depends on art's reflection of an attitude towards this condition and what kind of socialization you want to take place through the institution and how you propose to theorize it. Let's take the entropy first. Throughout the 80s, the idea of the death of art was a big notion. At this point, culture reveled in negativity, with the no future of the punk movement, for instance, or the melancholy of the postmodern, and so on. You could say that the death of art was the anti-utopia of postmodernism. Art historian Hal Foster, to quote him again, later returns to this theme or refrain of the death of art in his essay from 2002 called "This Funeral is for the Wrong Corpse," in which he rhetorically asks for a stay of sentence. He asks, quote, "Might art be granted the possibility of living on," unquote. And of course he says, well, yes, it can. And then he quotes some examples from the 90s, the contemporary art of the 90s. And this discussion of art's death and its possibility of living on is a discussion that seems out of key, I think, in relation to the 90s. It doesn't really gel in relation to the art of the 90s. Institutionally speaking, I think it's so simply because of the simple growth in art's institutional scale and the apparatus of mediation around art. With new mega institutions and with the proliferation of art events, art became too big to fail. So the idea of the death of art itself died from pragmatism, if you will. But more than that, also art returned with new definitions of the political. So to declare art dead is not just a cultural critique or a cultural diagnosis, it's also a privilege. So if you see art through the traditions of feminist art, for instance, it's hard not to see a revitalization of art over the last 50 years or more. The same can be said of art that reflects new intersectional or decolonial histories and subjectivities. In this sense, the idea of the death of art was no doubt a Northern Hemisphere, first world thing that kept artistic production within certain geographical, disciplinary, critical boundaries. And I think that these are some of the artistic continuities from the 90s that still insist today. The work of Henrik Olesen, another Danish artist, can be called queer art of forms in depth that turn the screw of alienation. The cast of a corner in a room or of a milk carton owes its material presence to having performed a form. A cast is something unproduced or unworked and hard to place because it's a quasi-entity that plays positive form against itself. The cast is both the work and its social double, you could say, and it teams with displaced agency. There is something about Olesen's works that is totally kinky, what with their refusal to do it in the right place. They oscillate through semiotic and affective registers and refuse that which can be named and affirmed. So even though the reference for his work are often much more specific than their ephemerality lets on, you will look in vain for certainties to swear by. It's work that undoes origins and identifications. And because his work does this or works in this way, it has the effect to make conflict stick to it like flypaper. There's power in every nook and cranny in an exhibition by Olesen. And so there are power critiques and counter moves too, on the milk carton or in the screws that hold the brackets on the wall. There are no vacuums or oases or bubbles in capitalism here. You only have ultra mundane items, consumer items, for instance, or found objects that are rendered unfamiliar, such as to unposition them strategically against all the neoliberal noise that surrounds them. It is a play of everyday excess, you could say. You could call Olesen's works for trans objects, to borrow a term from ideològica. The trans object is at the same time a sub-object and an extra object that opens up to the energies of its own unmaking. The trans object is a fold or a pocket for transitory social content, ready to receive warm minds and bodies. And so it's a site for dealing with the renegotiation of binaries. And finally, I would like to mention the work of Pia Arke. Pia Arke was a Danish Greenlandic artist who died in 2007 and whose work in the recent decade, since 2010 more or less, has enjoyed more international attention than it was given while Arke was alive. Arke created her grainy photographs in the Kronborg series with the help of a homemade camera. The resulting images that display the Danish castle Kronborg in ghostly vistas and overlaid by shadows of the artist's body call to mind William Shakespeare's play Hamlet that takes place at the castle of Kronborg. And of course, Shakespeare's play is a story of guilt and retribution and haunting. A symbol of the Danish crown, Kronborg Castle has a particular charge for Denmark's historic and cultural colonial relation to Pia Arke's native Greenland. In 1997, the sociologist Avery Gordon wrote about what she called following the ghosts among history's repressed stories and unmapped spaces in order to make, quote, a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located, unquote. This is really great, I think, this idea of following the ghost to make a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you're located. The result of a historic violation, the ghost offers transformational contact. The ghost is something or somebody that has been overruled and silenced, and that returns, or who returns, to a compromised reality. A meditation on how to create new versions of reality in order to tell other stories. Arke's photographs are effectively toned, having something at the same time mournful and exhilarating about them. They are eclipsed by limits of representation, but still they open up to something not yet existing. There is no utopian pathos at all in the works of neither Henrik Olesen nor of Pia Arke. But to quote Jean Baudrillard, of all people, from a wonderful text called Utopia Deferred from 1969, perhaps utopia can be codified in a way that agrees with Olesen's and Arke's confrontations of the real. Baudrillard wrote, "Utopia is never spoken, never on the agenda. It's always repressed in the identity of political, historical, logical, dialectical orders. It also haunts and crosses them irrevocably, forcing them into an overstatement of rationality. Utopia doesn't write itself into the future. It is always, from right now, what the order of the day is missing," unquote. And I think that we can credit Arke and Olesen with a similar haunting of society's ordering mechanisms, in which the ghost of utopia becomes a figure of absence that is intimately entwined with life as it is lived today and with history as it could become. And this will be the provisional conclusion to my working through and picking apart of the terms of the social, the 90s, and of utopia. Or it's a conclusion instead of a conclusion, if you will. At least I hope that it can, well, inspire you to ask some questions of your own and explore new trajectories through this material. And I look forward to discussing with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Muchas gracias, Lars. No se me ocurre mejor manera de terminar el curso que esta conferencia, en el que se retoman muchos de los hilos que se han ido abriendo en las distintas charlas y que se responden algunas preguntas y se hacen también muchas otras, que creo que es la única manera que podemos concluir una reflexión acerca de una década cuya historiografía está siendo efectivamente revisada. Lars ha hablado de una oleada de recepción del arte de los años 90, que lleva un tiempo, desde luego, produciéndose. Me hace pensar en esta idea de que cada generación inventa a sus predecesores Y en ese sentido cabría también preguntarnos en qué sentido estamos invocando nosotros a la generación de los 90, ¿no? Quería abrir el turno de preguntas a Lars, como siempre en el botón que tenéis abajo a la derecha de preguntas y respuestas, y yo se las iré transmitiendo. Bueno, si no, de momento no veo preguntas, entonces quería apelarte a ti directamente, Lars. ¿Qué crees que estamos buscando actualmente en los 90? ¿No? Porque esta reflexión acerca de los 90, más allá de la historia, ¿no? de simplemente el hecho de que haya pasado suficiente tiempo como para que ya los 90 sean una década de la historia del arte? Bueno, decir también que las preguntas las podéis hacer en cualquier idioma que os apetezca.
Yeah. So, sorry, could you? I forgot to switch on the interpretation button here. Could you could you repeat the question in English, please? You were asking what it is we're looking for in the art of the 90s. Is that right?
La puedo hacer en inglés. Bueno, decía bueno, que de momento no veo preguntas, entonces que me lanzo yo a interpelar a Lars preguntándole qué cree él que estamos buscando en esta
Yeah.
en esa segunda relectura de los 90, ¿no? ¿Por qué cree él, además de por el hecho de que sea ya una década historizable, qué estamos buscando en los años 90, ¿no? ¿Por qué los interpelamos ahora, crees tú, Lars?
Yeah, yes, yeah. I'm tempted to ask you the same the same question, and I really wish that I followed the other lectures presentations of the course, because when I received your invitation, I think it's almost a year ago by now. I was I was very. I mean, I was curious about the reasons about your reasons for for taking up this inquiry into the 90s again. And of course, I sensed, I could from the other speakers and the other, lectures in the series, I can sort of I get a strong sense of the direction of the inquiry and of your discussions here. That in your case, it seems that you're looking for, relations between art and activism of that decade. But what are we looking for? As I as I started by saying, I'm a product of the decade. So so I'm so in that sense, I'm actually not the best person to ask what we're looking for there. But because it will also, I mean, it's because the question of the 90s is sort of it's effectively toned to, in that sense, it's part of my nervous system. I think, as I mentioned, if there is a sort of an idea or an overarching question of my talk, it was to look at how or to think about how the 90s has been sort of a passage for contemporary art as we know it, and maybe we are now moving towards, a place where it becomes obvious that certain idea of contemporary art is of course a historic construction. So maybe we're on the brink of something else, of something new. I'm sure that there are generations after me, younger than me, who have already subverted the art of the 90s many times over. But in the bigger picture, if I'm right that there was a certain institutional formatting of the notion of contemporary art taking place in the 90s, then it would be interesting to, I think, look for the paradigm shift, the change that might happen now. I mean, in relation to the field of art, if you think of someone like Harald Seemann that I used as an example, and who was, a big figure, this prototype of curating in the 90s. I mean, in general, we're in a cultural moment when we're getting rid of the patriarchs, whether in art or in the field of culture at large. That would be one thing that is changing. Then there is, I perceive some doubt or confusion today about institutional formats. For instance, the biennial would be an example of this, because in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the biennial was the emblematic exhibition format as a phenomenon that connected artistic production to cities and geographies and to theory as well. That's not necessarily the case anymore, I think. There's been a shift, or a shift in attention, and a shift in power as well, perhaps there. I'd also say that today museums are at a crossroads where they need to make up their minds about whether they want to capitalize from the spectacularization of art, or if they want to support artistic experimentation and the historical memory of it. And I think that what I talked about, or what I mentioned in passing a few times, that art became so involved in the social reproduction in the 90s and thereafter, that today there is a longing for the secrecy of art. I think I know that, Julia, you're also, like myself, researching esoteric art and occult art, and I don't know if this is anti-90s exactly, but I think it's this type of interest would describe a certain longing for the secrecy of art, a certain obscurity. Yeah. And then, of course, there is the whole dynamics of globalization that's changing. And with this, the internationalization of art is also changing. And the internationalization of art was a big driver of the art of the 90s. Our habits of consumption are changing today because of the environmental crisis. And these are things that are bound to have an effect on art and its making, and its institutions too. Yeah. This was a very roundabout way of replying to you, but hope it makes some sense.
Tiene todo el sentido. Lo que pasa es que creo que estamos pensando más en lo que no hay o sea, no estamos buscando de los 90, ¿no? En qué es ahora diferente de los intentos, de las paradojas, ¿no?, que hubo en los 90. A lo mejor luego podemos seguir, pero hay una pregunta que la voy a decir yo en castellano, supongo que Silvia la está diciendo también en inglés, que es de Pepe Jiménez, que pregunta: ¿qué formatos de presentación del arte contemporáneo te parecen más viables y necesarios en la actualidad?
Yeah, thanks, Pepe. Yeah, for me, it hasn't changed so much. I would say. I mean, I work with the exhibition and I work with the text and the book. Those are sort of my outputs, and that's a dialectic that, or a tension that I find very productive myself, because the exhibition is always bound up with institutional space as a realm of the possible. It will always be decided by budgets, by logistics, by architecture, etc., etc. On the other hand, I think the realm of the text is, or the realm of the book is in a sense a freer realm, to put it like that, where that is open to theoretization and to speculation, and to other types of experiment than what you can do in the exhibition. So in that sense, I'm a believer. I'm old school, to put it like that. I'm very orthodox in my in my methods. Yeah.
Bueno, no veo más preguntas, entonces voy a insistirte, ¿no? Porque bueno, antes me has hablado de lo que crees que es distinto de los 90, lo cual me parece fabuloso porque has hecho como una síntesis de de este terreno tan difícil de cartografiar que es la realidad, ¿no? Pero efectivamente, si hoy ya no queremos patriarcas, si hoy ya está sobre la mesa todas las cuestiones relacionadas con la transversalidad, ¿qué es exactamente lo que buscamos en los 90, ¿no? Supongo que tiene que ver con esta idea que comentabas tú y que también tiene que ver con el trabajo de N55, que es esta noción de coger los caminos de la historia que quedaron a medias, ¿no? Los caminos no recorridos de la historia. Pero claro, ¿cuáles son los que buscamos en los 90? ¿No? Son esos caminos que queremos seguir recorriendo y nos engañamos a nosotros mismos en esos caminos o realmente estuvieron allí en los 90. Esa es un poco la pregunta que te hago y que me hago también en realidad.
Yeah. I mean, I've in my talk, I used the ghost as a kind of guide or guiding figure for looking through the 90s and also what parts we're looking for today, what we're taking with us, and I think that's. I mean, it's the ghost is always a great figure to use when you want to articulate your doubts about something. And when I started thinking about the terms of the social and of utopia and of the 90s as well, there was I had doubts also, just in the sense of sort of because to me they are ambiguous terms. I mean, the term of the social, for instance, is it's a bit of a shapeless term. I mean, it's an elusive term. It can mean so many things. It meant one thing to Palle Nielsen and his activist network in the 1960s. It means something else to the sociologists. It meant something else in Scandinavia in the 1990s. So it has different meanings that are specific to different histories and to different vocabularies and disciplines. So this was also the uncertainty that I wanted to keep in play. But yes, as suggested, what we can take with us from the 90s. I mean, there is. I still have a lot of respect and enthusiasm for this type of collaborative, self-organized work exemplified in my talk by Concern or N55. I mean, there is a great deal of political autonomy in this stance. It's very grassroots, to put it plainly, and I think that is still a viable methodology, very much so. And then there were my last examples of Henrik Olesen and Pia Arke, and I think that both of them are artists in the case of Henrik Olesen, he's someone who started in the mid 90s as well, and he's still going strong. Thankfully, Pia Arke unfortunately died in 2007. But I think the fact that they work with critiques of power and history from the perspective of queer histories in Henrik Olesen's case, and from a decolonial perspective in Pia Arke's case, those are continuities that those are the continuities I would be looking for instance. I remember that, I mean, I've never actually dealt with the work of I've never actually dealt or written about, curated the work of Pia Arke, and I remember having the chance to review an exhibition of hers in Copenhagen in 1999, I think it was, and after that I sort of lost touch with her work, but so that's also one reason why I'm bringing it up today, as there is a rectification to be made. I mean, I wasn't very tuned into the problematic of decolonization at that point. So this is a very specific case of the 90s speaking back to me now.
Bueno, esto también es lo que quería también este curso, ¿no? Abrir campos de diálogo entre unas épocas y otras, ¿no? Y abrir un campo de diálogo, un túnel que nos conecte a los años 90, un poco, desde luego, inevitablemente trayendo la visión actual que deformará la visión de los años 90, pero también intentando hacer el ejercicio opuesto, aunque sea imposible hacerlo por completo, de traer la visión de los 90 al presente y ver qué nos trae, ¿no? Ese ejercicio de distorsión voluntaria. Muchas gracias, Lars. No sé si hay más preguntas. Tampoco quisiera que se alargase demasiado. Es una pena terminar un curso como este, ¿no? Buscando utopías del pasado, con una sesión final de recapitulación en la que el diálogo es una pantalla de chat, pero bueno, como siempre, como seres humanos vamos a hacer lo que podamos con esta situación, y a ver que dentro de unos años qué ideas nos hemos inventado, qué formas de autogestión, qué formas de autoorganización nos hemos inventado para, bueno, esquivar las distopías del presente. Y los tiempos distópicos siempre son tiempos ricos también en utopías, así que esperemos que las vayamos haciendo, que vayan surgiendo. Muchas gracias a Alicia, muchas gracias a todos los participantes, muchas gracias Lars, muchas gracias a todo el equipo técnico del Macba, muchas gracias a Ricardo, muchas gracias a Pablo por la invitación, y muchas gracias a todos los que nos habéis acompañado, primero presencialmente y luego a través del otro lado de la pantalla del ordenador. Comentaros que se va a editar un libro con los textos de las conferencias para que siga teniendo vida en un tercer incluso formato, ¿no? Primero la presencia, luego el vídeo, YouTube, el libro. Bueno, este curso multiformato pues va a tener también esta manifestación a partir de una publicación. Y bueno, pues esperamos veros en otros cursos y estar juntas de nuevo en otras actividades. Muchas gracias.